Sometimes the worst decision of your life is the one everyone else can see, except you. On a dry March morning in 2019, 61-year-old widow Della Mae Hutchins stood in a county office in Garfield County, Oklahoma, and signed away $5,000 for 200 acres of land no one wanted. The fields were cracked white with alkali, the irrigation ditches had collapsed, and not a single profitable crop had grown there in 11 years. The Cresswell brothers, relieved to be rid of it, shook her hand like men who had finally unloaded a burden. Neighbors whispered that grief had clouded her judgment. Some called her stubborn. Others said she was throwing away the last money she had. And they were not entirely wrong about the risk. Della Mae was no wealthy investor chasing a bargain. She had already lost her husband, most of the family farm, and nearly every piece of security she had spent decades building. That $5,000 was not spare cash. It was a final reserve, a fragile line between rebuilding her life and losing what little remained. Yet she bought the farm anyway. Not because she believed in miracles, but because she had learned that land often tells a different story to those patient enough to listen. While everyone else saw dead soil, ruined fences, and another failed field, Della Mae saw a question no one had bothered to ask. And beneath those 200 barren acres, hidden far below the cracked surface, waited an answer powerful enough to change everything. But she still had to prove them all wrong. But the real reason Della Mae risked everything had begun 3 years earlier, with a loss far greater than any failed harvest. In the summer of 2016, her husband Roy died after years of ignoring the warning signs of a weak heart. His death left behind more than silence in the farmhouse. It exposed operating debts Della Mae had never fully understood, loans Roy had carried alone because he believed protecting her meant keeping the burden hidden. Within 2 years, the bank claimed 360 acres of their 400-acre wheat farm. Fields they had planted together for decades disappeared behind legal notices, auction papers, and numbers printed in cold black ink. Della Mae was left with only the 40-acre homestead, an aging truck, a loyal dog, and the memory of a life built row by row. Friends told her to sell what remained and move closer to her daughter. The advice was practical, but to Della Mae, leaving the farm would mean surrendering more than property. Roy's family had worked that Oklahoma soil for 3 generations, and she had given nearly her entire adult life to preserving it. Farming was not simply how she earned money. It was how she understood duty, grief, and who she was. She was not searching for a sudden fortune when she bought the abandoned 200 acres. She was searching for enough land to rebuild a working operation, protect the legacy she and Roy had created, and prove that loss did not have to become the final chapter. That purchase was not greed, it was resistance. And Della Mae was prepared to fight for that legacy, even if every acre seemed determined to defeat her forever. But the most dangerous mistake on that farm was not hidden in the soil. It was hidden in the certainty of the men who sold it. Harlan and Boyd Creswell had inherited 1,800 acres from their father and spent 20 years turning land into calculations. They knew crop yields, drainage grades, tax values, and when a field stopped earning its place. By those measures, the eastern 200 acres were beyond saving. The soil carried heavy sodium deposits, rainwater ran across the surface instead of sinking in, and a hard pan layer trapped roots near the top. One tenant had abandoned the property after 3 failed seasons. The irrigation ditches had collapsed, the pond had nearly disappeared, and even native grass struggled to survive. To the Cresswell brothers, the evidence was complete. They priced the parcel at $5,000 because they believed that was more than it deserved. They were not foolish men, and they were not cruel. That was what made their error revealing. Experience had made them efficient, but it had also made them certain. They had trained themselves to ask only one question: what can this land produce now? They never asked what it might contain, what had caused its strange chemistry, or whether the visible damage was telling only half the story. Their mistake was not selling the farm. Their mistake was believing that everything valuable could be measured from the surface. And as Della Mae would soon discover, the numbers they trusted had missed the one thing that mattered most. But what Della Mae found next was so small that almost anyone else would have stepped over it. and that was exactly why it mattered. Instead of rushing to plow the fields or plant a desperate crop, she began by watching. Before sunrise, while the air was still cool and the county roads were empty, she walked the property with a notebook, a hand probe, and the patience of someone who had learned not to trust first impressions. Most of the farm behaved exactly as everyone expected. The soil was pale, cracked, and hard enough to resist the probe. Then, near a shallow depression where an old creek bed curved through the northeastern corner, the pattern changed. That ground was darker there. The cracks were narrower. A thin strip of volunteer grass survived along the low channel, green and stubborn after weeks without meaningful rain. Delamay knelt, pushed the probe 18 inches into the earth, and felt less resistance. When she pulled it free, the metal was damp. She did not celebrate. She did not tell the neighbors. The next morning, she returned and tested the same spot again. Then she tested it 3 feet away, 10 feet away, and farther up the old creek line. For nearly 3 weeks, she recorded soil temperature, moisture depth, grass color, wind conditions, and every trace of recent rainfall. The numbers kept repeating the same strange message. One corner of a dead farm was being fed by something below. She marked each location with wooden stakes, building a quiet map that no ordinary drought could explain. That was when curiosity hardened into suspicion. Delamay still did not know what she had found, but she knew one thing with certainty. The land was contradicting the story everyone had told about it. And sometimes the smallest contradiction is where the truth begins. But the clue Delamay had mapped in silence was about to reveal something far larger than a damp patch of soil. She called Dr. Raymond Good, a hydrologist she had met years earlier at an agricultural conference, and read him every measurement from her notebook. He listened without interrupting. Then he asked to see the land himself. Over the next 6 months, Dr. Good returned with testing equipment, drilled sample points, studied the old creek channel, and compared the moisture pattern with regional geological maps. What he found changed the meaning of the entire farm. The property sat above an aquifer recharge zone connected to a much larger underground formation, a vast layer of water-bearing rock and sediment capable of storing and slowly releasing groundwater. The moisture Delamay had discovered was being pushed upward through tiny spaces in the soil, much like water climbing through the fibers of a cloth. Even more surprising, the white alkaline crust that everyone had treated as proof of death was also part of the evidence. For decades, mineral-rich groundwater had risen toward the surface. The water evaporated in the Oklahoma heat, but the minerals remained behind, leaving pale deposits across the fields. The very stain that had convinced farmers the land was worthless was pointing to the water hidden below it. Dr. Good refused to rely on one conclusion, so 2 independent survey companies tested the property. Their results matched his. Beneath the cracked soil lay a reserve connected to a formation large enough to support agricultural and municipal use for years. Delamay had not found a miracle. She had followed a contradiction until science gave it a name. And when the final report arrived, Dr. Good placed it on her kitchen table and told her the truth plainly. The farm everyone had dismissed was sitting above one of the most valuable resources in that region. But the discovery that should have secured Delamay's future immediately placed it in danger. Independent experts valued the groundwater rights beneath her property at nearly $40 million, a vast figure in a region suffering through years of weak rainfall. Within weeks, water developers called. A municipal authority requested meetings, and strangers drove past the farm. Then the Cresswell brothers returned, not in person but through attorneys. Their lawyers argued that the aquifer might extend beyond Delamay's boundary, and hinted that ownership could be disputed. For the first time since buying the land, she feared that the truth she had uncovered might be taken from her before she could benefit from it. She locked away her notebooks, copied every moisture record, secured the geological reports, and refused to discuss the discovery publicly. She then contacted Joanna Pruitt, an Oklahoma City attorney specializing in water rights, and asked her to examine every line of the original sale. Days passed without reassurance. Delamay imagined courtrooms, frozen accounts, and legal fees large enough to destroy what remained of her farm. Finally, Joanna called. The contract was clean. The sale had transferred the land completely, and Oklahoma law gave Delamay the statutory rights to the groundwater beneath her property. The Creswells had sold more than dry soil. They had unknowingly sold the resource below it. Their claim collapsed before it could become a lawsuit. Only then did Delamay allow herself to understand what the number meant. She had not merely saved her farm. She now controlled a resource powerful enough to rebuild it. But one careless decision could still ruin everything. But the most important decision Delamay made came after the money was finally within reach. Water companies offered fast deals, larger checks, and extraction plans designed to move as much groundwater as possible. She could have sold the rights, left Oklahoma, and never worried about another failed harvest. Instead, she slowed everything down. Delamay met with hydrologists, soil specialists, and regional planners until she understood how quickly the aquifer could recharge and how much pumping it could safely support. She then negotiated a long-term access agreement that limited annual extraction, required constant monitoring, and guaranteed that the reserve would remain useful for future farms and communities. The revenue gave her security, but she used it first to repair what everyone else had abandoned. Crews cleared the collapsed irrigation ditches and rebuilt the damaged lines. Agricultural gypsum was worked into the alkaline soil to reduce the effects of sodium. Drought-tolerant cover crops were planted to hold the ground together, improve organic matter, and protect the recharge zone from erosion. The work was slow, expensive, and far less dramatic than discovering millions of dollars beneath the farm. Yet it mattered more to Delamay. By the fall of 2021, green vegetation had begun spreading across fields that had looked lifeless for more than a decade. Water moved through repaired channels. Soil that once rejected rain started absorbing it again. Each season proved that patient stewardship could create more value than one quick sale. Delamay had not treated the aquifer like a prize to be emptied. She had turned it into lasting security while healing the land above it. Her true victory was not that she became wealthy. It was that the farm could finally live again. But the final truth of Delamay's story was even more valuable than the water beneath her fields. One afternoon, as green cover crops moved in the Oklahoma winds, her neighbor stood at the edge of the restored farm and asked what everyone was thinking. "How did you know?" Delamay looked across that land, once dismissed as useless, and said, "I didn't. I just refused to call it worthless before I looked." That was the difference. The aquifer had not appeared because she believed harder than everyone else. It had always been there, hidden beneath the salt, the cracks, and years of failure. Delamay simply paid attention long enough to see that the surface was not telling the whole story. And that lesson reaches far beyond farming. People walk away from ideas because the first attempt fails. They abandon opportunities because results arrive slowly. Sometimes they even give up on themselves because one difficult season convinces them nothing valuable remains. But exhaustion is not always emptiness, and failure is not always the end. What looks barren may still hold possibility beneath it. Before you judge the next field, dream, or chapter of your life, look deeper. If this story made you think differently about what others dismissed too quickly, subscribe to Solace Farm Stories. Tell us in the comments what stayed with you, and share this story with someone who may need to hear it today.